I am thrilled to introduce Dr. John Marshall and Liza Marshall, who are the authors of the book Off of Our Chats. It's a candid book, candid tour through the world of cancer. Liza Marshall is a retired communications attorney, is a founding board member of Hope Connections for Cancer Support in Bethesda, Maryland. In 2006, at the age of 43, Liza was diagnosed with the deadliest form of breast cancer, triple negative. She continues to be an active volunteer at Hope Connections in her church and in her community, serving on boards, directing development campaigns, and supporting a variety of communications and missions. Dr. John Marshall received his training at Duke University, the University of Louisville, and Georgetown University. He's an internationally recognized expert in new drug development for GI cancer. Dr. Marshall has become an outspoken advocate for GI cancer patients and the importance of clinical research participation. In 2020, he and his wife, Liza Marshall, published this book. We are thrilled to have the two of you. Thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jillian. We really appreciate it. We're very honored to be here, and thanks to Cynthia and Joni for helping us make the connection. So we really appreciate that, and glad to talk with you all today. I will just give you a little of what I refer to as the sort of soft introduction of each of us. So John grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, in I guess in the 60s and the early 70s, and had a very, I think, typical for 60s, 70s upbringing of the freedom to run around, together with his friends during the summer, and just that joy and relaxed life that I think we were able to live maybe in those days, maybe not. We were looking back on it as if it was much more idyllic than it actually was, but had, again, just a very traditional upbringing until he was 13, and when his mother died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So John had an early experience with an exposure to cancer, and not only exposure to, but losing a family member to it. And I think he'd always been interested in science, in thinking he was going to be a doctor, but and I'm sure not right away, but started to build an interest in oncology. And I think many people who are in oncology sort of have had that personal experience that makes them really want to go to it, to be called to it, because you really almost have to be called to oncology, I think, in many ways, to do it. But as John trained here, we're in his office. I'm wearing my armband because they won't let me in without looking like I'm a patient.
Don't tell.
Yeah, right. It's okay. The boss is here and she knows. But anyway, so he came to the Lombardi Cancer Center at Georgetown, which to do his residency and fellowship. And it was then and still is a very breast cancer centric center. And so much of the training was very breast cancer focused, with this kind of feeling that other cancers really just weren't that important, or the feeling that John got anyway. And so he tends to root for the underdog, and he started to develop this sort of, developed an interest in GI cancers, I think in part because they were very underrepresented. Plus he had a mentor that he really loved who was in that area. And so as part of his development of interest in GI cancer, he started to develop a kind of resentment of the whole breast cancer movement, and the fact that they, in many ways take up as much of the oxygen in the room for funding, for advocacy. We all know what color breast cancer ribbons are. The White House turns pink in October, and it's everywhere, but we don't tend to know what the other ribbons are, and don't hear about the other cancers nearly as much. So in 2006, I made the mistake in many ways, probably, of developing breast cancer, and which was probably a stab in John's heart in some ways. Well, maybe again, in probably many ways. But anyway, that is the beginning of this piece of the story.
Yeah, let me introduce Liza. Liza was born in Wilmington, Delaware, grew up in Dayton, Ohio, then moved back to Washington, D.C. Also, I think a pretty idyllic, a little different, but idyllic childhood. Went to school in England for 3 years during junior high school. So Hogwarts, I think.
Yeah.
I've married somebody.
I'm a secret wizard.
She's a Gryffindor. Actually, you're more of a Ravenclaw. I don't know what you are. But But then we ended up going to high school across the street from each other. I at the sort of snobby boarding school in Alexandria, Virginia, and Liza at the public high school across the street, known famous high school for Remember the Titans, is the school Liza went to in Alexandria. We didn't know each other there, of course. And then at college we met. I was having what certainly is a top 5 low day for me. The night before, I was pretty depressed about my grades and my life and having no real parental influence ever since my mother died. My father was not that attentive to us, and we were just continued to roam free and do whatever you could do for yourself. And I was a bit lost, more than a bit lost, and prayed to God that hadn't done that in a while, that something would help me, something would come from above and help me. And that next night, I was tapping a keg as the social chairman of my fraternity, and was introduced to this woman sitting next to me, and it was instantly love. That night, we knew it. I got a kiss. That's all I got that first night, but I got a good kiss. We went back and told our friends that we were in love. Neither group believed that would be possible because we were so different, came at things so differently, but we knew it was right. Right after college, we got married. We then put each other through graduate schools. Liza did more of the putting me through than I did putting her through. But we went to law school, we went to medical school, we went to residency and fellowship, and we ended up in Washington, D.C. We had 2 children. We still do. We haven't lost them yet. They're somewhere around. And our lives were busy. Liza had slowed down her law practice, eventually quitting, to be volunteer and mom and running and managing all of our lives. My career got busier and busier as a physician, as a grumpy person against breast cancer and an advocate for GI cancers. And one morning we were getting ready for work and the day, and we had just gotten out of the shower, and Liza had leaned into the mirror to check something on her face. And I looked over into the mirror and noticed that her breasts had pulled funny when she leaned forward, that the skin from the breast was pulling back, and which really, as a physician, you know right away that is essentially inflammatory breast cancer. That's a very high stage, aggressive breast cancer. And for whatever reason, I denied that I saw it. The important part of this is that Liza already knew something was wrong. Her breast was swollen, and she was planning to get a biopsy of it. She then gets a biopsy. I sort of again forgot that we were doing all of this. And then on the Monday morning of Thanksgiving week, 2006, and all the people on this call know how busy that week is going to be. I was sitting not in this office, but just down the hall, going through my daily stack of papers. I was on the phone to my ear with Liza, as we did most mornings. We kind of checked into each other to see who was going to pick up the kid and walk the dogs. And I came across a breast cancer pathology report. And I'm like, I don't do breast cancer. And I looked to the top of it, and it had Liza's name on it. And so I just couldn't help myself but blurt out and said, you have breast cancer. Well, I'm incredibly funny, but somehow this fell flat for sure. And but anyway, I just so you know, oncologists and doctors in general really don't like to give bad news. And I was the one who gave Liza the bad news that we were going to start this journey of breast cancer.
So that's sort of set up, I guess, for the book. And the next phase is sort of, and we'll just give you sort of a quick background on how and why we wrote the book. It was not something that we thought of. I did not keep a blog during my treatment. We both kind of plodded along day to day, and but a friend of ours there was an article written about us for Hope Connections for cancer support, and as part of that, a friend said to us, this would be, you all bring a unique perspective to this, with John being an oncologist, and again, it specifically his breast cancer situation, and that that we would also I was pretty involved in the cancer community already because of John's work. And so switching from sort of an advocate to becoming an actual somebody having this experience. So but it took us a while to get going. We actually first had this idea in 2013, and we tried to write it and didn't really have the time or the mental space. And I think in retrospect realized that there were a lot of things that we needed to say in the book that other people in our lives were probably not ready to hear, and maybe each other too. And we'll talk about that a little bit, that sort of the things you can't talk about with your caregiver. But anyway, we finally, John, as part of this, he sort of changed the way he practiced, or he very significantly changed the way he practiced, I think, and really tried to recreate for many people this very personal situation that we had. We knew all the doctors. I ended up being treated at Georgetown. These were friends of ours. People took, incredible care of us, and, we didn't have to schedule anything. Everybody, everything was done. And so John tried to really recreate this for his own patients, and he started giving out his cell phone number and his email, which was lovely, but over time that it really became a real drain on him because those boundaries started to drop, and John was there wasn't a point where he really could take time for himself. It was sort of this constantly being on. And so he started to burn out and really was, I think unhappy. He managed to hold it together. I think it worked, but he would come home and
and didn't hold it together.
Right, did not hold it together. And so my daughter and I actually sort of held a little intervention for him and said, you really ought to be thinking about, seeing a therapist, which he did. But at the same time, he also, Georgetown, John is an employee at the university, and he was able to take a sabbatical, which was something very needed and also something very wonderful, which also allowed us to write the book. So we wrote separately our two sections. We really didn't talk to each other much about it for the first 2 months. We talked about a lot of other things, but not that. And then exchanged what we wrote and read each other's, and had some, it was hard. I mean, the days when we read what the other one had written, we each had written some things that we really hadn't said before and that were hard.
This kind of became a diary for me of some sorts. I mean, Liza got her chart and immediately, I think, even smelled things again that when you started to read through what had happened in the medical record and her calendar and the like. So Liza sort of told the story like it was. And as I started writing, I just poured out of me. I just had all sorts of things to say about the medical community, about cancer centers, about research, but also about relationships and what I was feeling and what I was thinking, and not ever really believing anyone would ever read what I was writing. And so it was more therapeutic in some ways to get that out. But then sharing that with Liza was dangerous. Waiting 15 years was probably a good idea at that point. And also being in Oxford where we were and being on our own together also was, I think, the right place to exchange that information. It was almost as if we were on a couple's retreat in some way to really exchange all of those feelings and thoughts.
Jillian, I didn't know if did you have any questions or?
I don't have any questions yet. I wanted to remind, I didn't notice that in the beginning, I did not tell anyone to write questions that they might have in the chat. We typically do in the groups, but just as a reminder, please use the chat feature.
And I was saying to Jillian before that, we'd love this to be a conversation. So please don't feel you need to hold. If you have a question along the way, we're certainly happy to try to answer anyway. So just a little bit about why we wrote the book. I think it's relatively simple. We were really hoping to convey the perspectives of the three, what we sort of view as a triangle in the cancer care project. The patient, obviously, the caregiver, and the healthcare team, and particularly physicians. Obviously, that's the perspective that John particularly brings to this. And in the idea that, we all might see each other as humans, and humans who do bring their desires and their goals, but also their frailties and their emotional baggage to this thing, and that's true for every point of this. And in an effort to open up those conversations and have people see each other a little more clearly and maybe a little more empathetically in the process, and also recognizing that we'll talk a little bit about patient perspective, particularly first, and that patients don't walk in the door. You've just been hit with a cancer diagnosis, and so your first encounter with your healthcare team is not your best self necessarily, and very unlikely to be your best self, and certainly not your most cogent or coherent self. And so that shock of diagnosis and how that hits you. And then also recognizing that patients are so overloaded with information. Not only are they in the midst of a panic attack, but they are immediately being confronted with, in the first place, where are you going to have your treatment? And I mean, and you'd think even for me, that was a little bit simple in that John was at Georgetown, but we had discussions about whether I should go to see John has always advocated his patients getting second opinions. And so he definitely wanted me to do that. But we went just to a private practicing physician, sort of more in the suburbs. And it was a very different setting. I knew that I wanted to do clinical trials. John was the head of clinical research, so I sort of wasn't allowed not to, but I knew I wanted to do that. Again, I tend to be, community oriented. And I also believe in the importance of clinical research and how much not only that's good for patients, but it advances the state of research. None of us would get the treatment we get today if other people had not gone through clinical trials before us. So, as soon as I had picked where I was going to be treated, then there was this, list of all the different clinical trials that I could consider doing, none of which I knew anything about. I didn't know about breast cancer. I didn't know about the drugs that were used to treat breast cancer. And but yet I somehow had to figure out the answers to those questions. And I did, I had John on tap for that. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your feeling about clinical research and how, John was not a traditional caregiver in that he didn't feel comfortable, I think, telling me what to do or voting too much on what I should do.
Right from the beginning, I sort of withdrew from my doctor role. And I'm in that position of knowing too much. What I always think of as a traditional caregiver being is somebody who's really doing the research and pushing the healthcare team to make sure we have all the information we need, sort of the manager of the project. And because all I could really think about was how bad this could go, I didn't feel like I was going to be very effective, and I was only going to make Liza afraid in the things I was thinking. But further than that, if you vote and you're like a medical professional and you make an opinion, then if it doesn't go well, it's your fault. So if I voted in Liza's care and it didn't go well, then it would be my fault, and I'm her husband. It shouldn't be my fault. And this really has brought us back to this concept of shared decision-making with your healthcare team. And that is when the reason we use that language, shared decision-making, is because we don't really know the right answer. The white coats don't know the right answer. And so we teach you as much as we can teach you in 30 minutes, in 45 minutes, and maybe an hour, and then send you off to make a decision based on this very rapid, education you've received. And there's no way that you can really pick about what you want to do. But then once you do pick, we then put at the bottom of our note, patient picked this treatment. Now, I'm not responsible. I'm no longer, the white coat is off the hook. You picked the treatment, I didn't. And so we'll see how your pick went, right? So you're the one putting the chips on the table, and I'm just the house. I'll spin the wheel and see how it goes. And so, and then as a caregiver, I didn't want to be the one picking anymore. So I really did, I did manage things, I did organize things, but I didn't really vote.
Liza, how was that for you that John wasn't voting?
Yeah,
She doesn't let me vote on anything. I don't know what this was just.
It's all for the best, quite honestly. He gets to vote at work. I was conflicted, I think, in many ways. I both wanted to be told what to do and didn't want to be told what to do, and particularly by John. And I think we do all have, well, I shouldn't say all, I won't speak for your all's marriages or relationships, but I do think that with our spouse, there is that, as John says, there's sort of that you want to look to them for advice, and particularly somebody who was, obviously not only very experienced in cancer generally, but also one of our best friends here is, somebody John had done fellowship with, is the head of the breast cancer program. And so, he had access to a lot of answers, so to speak. But I also, as he said, I think it put a lot of pressure on him, and I'm not sure I really wanted to be told what to do. In the end, I actually picked, I think in the end, we actually
Agree.
mentally, with all about saying it, we picked the same clinical trial, and actually the one I went on had a negative result. It was just extra chemotherapy, and which was not really proven to have any benefit. Well,
it comes down to one of our conclusions about this, and looking back, is that you make a lot of decisions with two very strong emotions, one of which is fear and the other which is hope. And so, you those two things drive a lot of what you're doing. And sometimes to the point where you don't necessarily make wise decisions, but you make ones that you think have the best chance of keeping you alive either forever or longer. And so, so one of the ways this changed my practice, quite honestly, is that after our experience and knowing what it felt like to be on the other side, I now vote as the physician overseeing the patient. So I go through the options, I do the shared decision-making process, and then almost always, now not always, I try to read the room, but I almost always will say, if it was me, I don't say if it was you, I say, if this was me and this was the same situation, here's what I think I would do. And then I walk through the pros and cons and the trade-offs and why I might do that. Now, they don't always agree on the other side of the room, but at least I put it in my note that this is what I was recommending. So I think physicians have gotten kind of chicken, and I was chicken when Liza was, going through this. The same problem, just didn't want to be responsible for the end result. So, but we should be. That's what you're paying us for. We should be responsible. So I encourage our fellows and our other colleagues to, at the end of the discussion, vote. So.
One of the things I just, as part of the sort of patient piece, I think is, and I talk about this in the book, is recognizing that, cancer is a full-time job. And I was not working at the time. I had actually quit a year or two before. And I don't know, and I'm sure many of you are doing this, and I don't really know how people do it. It's, as treatment went on, I developed more and more side effects, and most of them were small, but everyone seemed to require seeing another specialist about something. So, not only was I seeing my oncologist every 2 weeks and getting treatment, which was, either a half day or a full day there, but somewhere along the way I would develop something and have to go see somebody else, which was, and as we all know, doctors' offices don't tend to move fast. And so there's a lot of sitting in waiting rooms and all of that. So I think trying to figure out how to balance your regular life with treatment is really one of the biggest challenges. And, from an emotional perspective, I think for both of us, we really did, I don't know if it's fair to say we tried not to change life too much, but, we both kind of just kept moving ahead with the things we had going on. And, I didn't drop off any of the boards I was on. People kept saying to me, don't you want to quit doing that? And I was like, no, because what am I going to do? Am I going to sit around all day and think about, what I'm going through and what might happen? And so I was, yes, I didn't make everything, but I was able to do a lot of things. And for me, as a mental coping mechanism, that really helped.
But it does, it absolutely affects relationships. A diagnosis of cancer. Yes, it's a full-time job. And so you've brought extra stuff to the table. I always half joke with my patients when they ask me about chemo brain. I said, before you got cancer, you had to juggle all of your life. You had to juggle work and kids and all the other things that you had to do. And now with cancer, and maybe that was 3 balls, but with cancer, you're throwing in a 4th ball and maybe a chainsaw, right? So when I drive home from work after work, I'm thinking about, what are we going to do for dinner? Do we have something cooking tonight? What's Netflix tonight? When you have cancer and you're driving home, you're thinking about, am I going to die tomorrow? When's my next test? And so executive function goes. And so relationships really become very, very important. Liza and I, going into her diagnosis, I think we're kind of in parallel play mode. We loved each other, but we were both doing our own things. And I see this all the time. When cancer comes home, some relationships get closer, and you sort of, the firm of Marshall and Marshall was back together. But many relationships get divided. There's the sexual dysfunction piece, the fatigue piece, the can't do all the things you need to do for each other piece. And the caregivers often trying to manage all of that without any of the joy and strokes that come, whereas the patient is very focused on trying to do the best they can to get better. So we do see a lot of division in relationships. And I'm just grateful that ours went together and not apart. But also part of this whole deal is the kids and the village around the couple. Liza wisely has noted that, and when she said it, now I get it. It took her to tell me, but the patient sets the tone for the village. So if the patient is sort of, anxious and upset and, surrounded by the people around that person want to make that better. And so they too often that's spread out. Whereas if the patient tends to be sort of more, life will come as it is, or I'm just going to keep life normal as normal as it can be, often the village has that same perspective. And now that she's noted that, and I watched that in all of my patients, I think it's really an insightful thing.
What I just say is that the sidelight to that, I mean, I think that is an emotional burden that patients bear in many ways, that they recognize that. And so there's that obligation to
be normal.
Or to be, put a positive face on all the time and, not complain or whatever. And I think that's hard. And I think groups like this in particular are wonderful, because I think finding a place where patients can vent much of that and share that with people who are going through it. It's hard to say that to your caregiver, and that they also, as John says, they're juggling the chainsaw too, and not to steal your joke, but and so, you don't want to throw something else into the mix for them. You recognize that they need your help and support as well.
Yeah, and one of the lessons I learned and then start to transmit to my patients is this concept of telling only one story. It's very common that patients and families will not tell the kids certain things, or won't tell work, or won't tell the neighbors. And so they're managing different stories in different venues. And this really started with managing our children, or helping to inform them. And on the day we found out about Liza's cancer, we did sit the kids down. They were 10 and 13 at that time. And they're smart kids. They're cancer kids. They grew up going to rounds and all sorts of stuff. So they had friends whose parents died of cancer. So they knew about this. And we told them that this is what's going on with your mom, and we'll tell you everything. If things change, we'll tell you. And what we learned later is, because we never really debriefed on this, right? So when they read the first draft of the book, like 2 years ago, they were both like, whoa, we didn't know, it's brought back all sorts of stuff for them that, they thought was fine, they were through with. And they really didn't understand at an adult level what we then told them as, early teens. And so one of our lessons or pieces of advice is, as you go along, it's important to hold those sort of debriefs, catch-ups on where things are. As your children grow, because they're able to understand things at a different level than when you first started. So it was, we didn't do that. And I think we could have done that and made things better. I just want to quick.
I was just going to say, I think there was a question
Oh,
about
yeah.
relationship with children, but I'm not sure if we answered it.
Yeah, so there was a couple of comments that I wanted to read. So this one was directed to John. It says, I love that you as a doctor share what you would do. I always ask as a patient, what would you do if it was you, your wife, your daughter? Thank you. Then Danae says,
So what I encourage I always say, I don't like my wife that much. What if it was me? So it is that, but we get that question a lot. And a lot of times doctors will dodge it.
and then Danae says to the two of you, you're both a great team and a wonderful life loving, sorry, I'm just my glasses if they get very close. Long support system, which many patients in this journey do not have. And then she continued, I completely agree, Dr. Marshall. I teach that mindset all the time. Setting the atmosphere is on the one where I should focus.
Yeah.
And Carly asked a question about children. She said, what about your overall relationship with your children?
Yeah, and I can elaborate on that question too, I guess, to be personal. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer at the same age.
Oh.
I was the same age as your children. So I was just wondering, how you dealt with, that time of their lives. It is, an important time, being a teenager and growing up, and how you juggled your treatment and your major responsibilities dealing with cancer and your relationship with them.
Let me go first, because I want to flash back to when I was 13 and my mother died of lymphoma, right? So and back then you didn't talk to kids, or certainly my parents didn't talk to us about it. And in fact, we never had that sit down discussion. We never had the, I'll write a letter to you in the future kind of thing that we do now. And it always stung me that I didn't, all of a sudden my mother was dead. No one gave us like a 2-week window of warning, and even after she died, we never really talked about it again. That's the way my father deals with things, to be quite honest. And so it's always stuck in me and so I've embraced trying to not let that happen to other kids parents that I was taking care of. So we tried to be proactive with our kids so that they were informed and in the loop.
Yeah, but balancing that with, I think with trying also not to have my treatment and our situation overshadowing what was going on in their lives. Our son was in 8th grade in a school that finished at 8th grade. So he was going through applying to high schools, and, we wanted him to be able to make those decisions without thinking about, do I need to stay near home or, and that kind of thing. And our daughter was in 5th grade, right? No, yeah, 5th grade. And so, she was just entering, and she's, we can have a discussion about boys versus girls, but in our case, they were pretty classic, right? Our son was like, and 14, he did not turn around and look back. He was sweet, but he didn't, our daughter was more, I don't know if we were overly sensitive to her, but she, I think, was more sensitive to the situation and was kind of, antenna up all the time about, is there a change in the atmosphere here? What's going on? And, she actually told us much later that she actually heard us having the conversation in our bathroom about my breast. We didn't know that until years later. So she already knew before I even had the biopsy that something was up. And so as John says, we tried to be honest, but we didn't sit them down every couple of weeks and say, this is what's going on. There wasn't something to report every couple of weeks, but even every 6 months, except, things are still okay. And so we don't know that we did the right thing. Right? It's a difficult, and every child is different, every parent.
Yeah. There is no right way to handle it. And that's why I was just curious.
No, but I think it's good to talk to people and find out their different approaches and see what you can incorporate.
Yeah. That kind of comes to, we didn't want this book, and I don't think it is an answer book. It's more to, describe the different emotions and issues that come up, tell you what we did, also tell you when we didn't do it right. Or at least our reflections on that, so that any person or couple going through a cancer diagnosis just has a better roadmap of some of the normal emotions and events that are required of us all as we go through the process. There were just a couple of high level things we'll review and then open it up Q&A for sure. One is that whole shared decision making piece about, do we what we can do and what we should do, what we have to do. Those are all different in different settings. One of the big themes of the book is side effects of treatment. And, as a physician giving out these drugs and treatments, we used to kind of wave off the lower level side effects until I experienced them secondhand through Liza. And low level side effects matter a lot. High level side effects matter a lot too. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about hair loss and just your take on all of that.
Yeah. So, well, maybe it's not obvious, but anyway, I did lose my hair. I knew I was going to lose my hair from the treatment. And, I didn't have good hair to begin with. So I envy all of you who have good hair, because it is even without a cancer treatment, it's a privilege to have hair that grows long and looks pretty, which mine never did. But so in a sense that made it easier for me, but I wasn't sure if I was going to get a wig, and somebody advised me early on that, well, actually, I think I went to the Look Good, Feel Better program at Georgetown, and the person who did it, the hairstylist, basically said to us, it just forestalls a lot of conversations, or forecloses a lot of conversations. When you're out in public, that way you don't have to tell everybody. They're going to ask you questions, and a scarf is obvious. I mean, most people, if you see somebody in a scarf, you figure they must be going through cancer treatment, even if they're not. And so for me, that was good advice. I was glad to kind of be able to put on a little disguise of normal when I went out, when I wasn't with people that I knew already. And then, I think the next question becomes, once you've gone, besides picking out the wig, which is its own fun adventure, or John and I had different perspectives on that, but when you decide to stop wearing it. And I decided fairly early on, partly because it was becoming summer, and honestly, it was itchy and it was hot, and I really just wasn't enjoying it anymore. And my hair was starting to come back in. Now, I will say, it was pretty obvious at that point. And I joke, I got this wig that did not look, in my opinion, that much like my regular haircut. I mean, it was short, but it was different. And when I stopped wearing it, several people at church, and we go to church every Sunday. So it was, these people saw me all the time, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" And I thought, you couldn't tell for 6 months that I was wearing a wig. So, it's interesting. People actually aren't, it's not, I do think a wig works pretty well as a disguise, apparently. But it actually, with my hair coming back in, I think, I was ready to do that. I sort of unveiled it at our son's 8th grade graduation, at which I ended up presenting the diplomas, and I did clear it with him first. I didn't want the graduation to be about my head and my cancer, and not about him. And again, he's pretty easygoing in many ways, and he was like, "Yeah, it's fine. I don't care." So.
Just between us, though, she looks hot bald. I just want to tell you that. It's
not hot enough to shave my head.
It is. Her husband approved all the way.
Yeah. So.
But side effects. So I'm big into value in healthcare. We spend a lot of money. We don't spend it very efficiently. And Liza had been getting anti-nausea medicine for her chemo, and she never threw up, but she was a little nauseous one cycle, and her doc.
Okay, more than one cycle.
Oh, quit. But my partner, who was taking care of her, gave her a drug called Amend. I'm sure many of you know about it. It's at the time a very expensive medicine. It's less expensive now. And I made the really tactful move of, saying, "What do you mean you're taking Amend? This big value cost thing." And I got a very nasty, appropriately nasty look from that comment of questioning why, why wouldn't we use the best medicines that were available? And it really was a focusing moment for me as I preach and write about the cost of cancer care, and we have to rein it in as a society. But now as an individual, why wouldn't you do the best you can for every individual, right? You see the conflict there from the individual to society. So that was an eye opener for me.
Yeah. And I think the other sort of big piece of the side effects is I was on, as I say, the clinical trial I was on was 6 rounds. Normally it's 4 rounds of 2 drugs, and I was at 6. And so as I started the next phase, which was Taxol, and we had added a platinum drug, my counts dropped precipitously. And the first time they adjusted the dose, but the second time I got the almost as bad call as the original diagnosis, which is your counts are too low to get treatment. And I think that's for many patients such a hard thing to hear, because it is, going ahead with your treatment seems like the most important thing in your life. I mean, it's if you don't have treatment, what's going to happen? Am I giving the cancer cells a chance to grow? Am I not doing what I should be doing? And I think it's maybe about the only time I really cried during this whole process. It really really upset me. And dealing with that is, in retrospect, I realize it probably didn't make that much difference, and heaven only knows keeping your blood counts up is hugely important for your overall health. And so, we put oncologists are obviously in a very difficult position of trying to balance these, all of the various things, the side effects and how much chemotherapy or whatever they can give you to treat your cancer while not also killing you in the process or leaving you, quite debilitated afterwards. And so imagine for many of you that has maybe been an issue along the way. It's a really, really tricky one. And I think important to recognize that it is a really emotional part of the journey, not just a medical part of the journey.
Yeah, and it's an emotional thing for us as the white coats. And I think maybe you know this, but part of what we wrote about is the impact of things that happen to our patients on us. So tomorrow I have 22 patients on my schedule. I've already looked at the schedule. I already know whose scans are good and whose scans, there's actually one bad scan tomorrow. With a portal, patients usually know before they come in nowadays. People are going in and looking at their own results often. Many don't. And so many are going to come in braced with their arm, their hands white knuckled, waiting for me to either smile or frown. And we know that we're the messenger on all of this. And when we see you upset, when we see you sad, when we see the air come out of you, it comes out of us too. We feel responsible for it. And we know we're just the messenger, right? And we didn't give people cancer and we didn't cause these things in that way, but we still feel responsible. And so part of what we're doing with these discussions is not only talking with patient advocates and support groups, but also we're doing medical grand rounds and talking to cancer centers around the country about that element of it. And how do we, particularly during the pandemic, how are we making sure we take care of each other and make sure we continue to be there for our patients and their families, which means we have to take care of ourselves. So we have about just 10 more minutes, I think, until I have to go to a meeting myself. But I didn't know, Jillian, if you want to maybe do Q&A for the last 10.
I think one question I had, and first acknowledge that, Liza, the 3 things that you talked about were so relevant and are the common things that come up in our groups, whether it's about the hair loss, the side effects, and then the combination of taking X, Y, and Z drugs to help with the side effects, but then those cause X, Y, and Z symptoms, and that whole balance. And then the last part about, last thing you said, one other thing that was not being able to because of your blood work. And I think that's also so common, of that you go for treatment, you sit there, you're all ready to go, and then the doctor comes in and says their blood work's not good, and that worry of what will this one session, missing this session, mean. So I think those are incredibly common topics, and you wrote about it beautifully, and I think it's just sometimes a relief for other women to hear somebody else talking about that. One question I had for John was, after your sabbatical, how did you balance your practice from what you learned as a caregiver but with also giving yourself more boundaries, because it seemed like how you were working obviously wasn't working for you.
It was a little different coming back because we came back early because of the pandemic. So I spent the first 3 to 6 months just trying to keep this place open during the pandemic. But then I did get back into patient care and have been ever since, back to essentially my full slate of patients. But to your point, I'm leaning on the portal, right? So instead of my email and my cell phone, I'm trying as much as possible to encourage patients to interface with us. It's like sending me an email, but the difference is that I can decide when I'm going to read it. So I can partition off time every day to stop and review what patients have sent in. Now, that doesn't replace an urgent need, and there's still the standard ways of getting a hold of us for that. But that has helped, I would have to say. But it's still, I guess I'm better at it, recognizing one's limitations and all has helped me deal with that better. There does need to be an objectivity, but I'm just not that good at that. So it's easier for me to help care for somebody if I really understand what they're going through, how they're feeling, what their support is. And the more you know about that person and their world, the more you have to feel, right? It's not just a chart and some scans and some numbers. It's a human and how it's going to change not just them, but others around them. So it requires effort. I mean, putting bluntly, it is part of what we need to teach physicians. Now, what a lot of physicians do, and I'm sure many of you have encountered these, and I'm even this way on bad days, is we can just block off and become sort of that, drive-through machine where we have no emotion. We are just going to tell you the facts and then get out of there and leave you cold, quite honestly. And there are plenty of docs out there that are like that. Not many in oncology, to be honest, but there are docs that find a way to go through life that way. But that, I think, in some ways that's their own personality, but in other ways it is what they have to do to defend their own emotional. Yeah.